Hello, my name is Mike Konczal. I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and a blogger at the site Rortybomb, and I am joined by
Chris Hayes, editor-at-large at The Nation magazine, host of Up with Chris Hayes on MSNBC, and author of the new book, Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy, which I will hold up to you. QuickTime very smartly figures out not to reverse the image, so you can actually read it legibly.
Nice. I sadly can't hold up my e-reader copy of it, so it looks kind of weird to do that. So it's good to still have physical copies of books, I suppose. This is another episode of Fireside Chats, the Roosevelt Institute's Fellows Program's weekly show, where we engage with people who we find interesting. I've just read your book, Chris, a little while ago, and I really enjoyed it. I just wrote a review for Dissent, and I'm really excited to spend some time talking to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, and I and my editor and other folks at Crown really loved the review. I thought it was fantastic.
Well, thank you. And also a huge fan of your show. Your show's been going strong for about 8 months now?
Yeah, we started September 17th, so where does that put us? Somewhere right around 8 months. I can't believe we've been on that long, but things are going pretty well.
As someone who came out of not television, but originally out of journalism, both in these times and still with The Nation, what has surprised you the most about running your own TV show, especially a weekly news-oriented one?
I think the two things that have surprised me most are, how much I love doing the show. I think it's my favorite thing I've ever done. Those 2 hours, it's like playing basketball is the only thing I compare it to, because it requires such full 1,000% attention and commitment and concentration. I mean, and that level of concentration is very enjoyable. It's pleasurable for the same reason that I love playing basketball, actually, and that's particularly the case, I think, in a media environment in which distraction is the norm. Like constantly checking our phones, checking the internet, being interrupted. So I really cherish the 4 hours that I do every weekend, and I think that I knew I liked doing it. I thought I would like doing it, but how much I love doing it has been a really nice, pleasant surprise.
Excellent. And somehow you've managed to finish writing a book in the meantime as well and get that published. And you're on tour now. Can you describe the main thesis of the book?
Yeah, I think there's kind of three main points that the book steps through. The jumping off point for the book is looking at what I call the crisis of authority in American life, which is the collapse of public trust in our pillar institutions, which all the survey data tells us is essentially at historically low levels across the board, with a few exceptions. And that, I think, structures our public life in all sorts of fascinating and destructive ways often. That was the starting point of the inquiry, and then I look at what is behind this lack of trust, and I make the case that it's actually a lot of institutional failure and a lot of elite failure, that actually the fail decade, as I call it, which is the last decade in American life, has been essentially an uninterrupted cascade of incompetence, corruption, and crisis. And then the question becomes, well, what is behind those institutional failures? What's producing this epidemic of elite failure? And I make an argument about the ways in which the social model that we have adopted in the last 20, 30, or 40 years, which we call the meritocracy, and I can get into that a bit, has produced an elite that is increasingly socially distant from the rest of the populace. And that social distance leads to all kinds of pathologies in the way elites conduct themselves, and all kinds of blind spots, also kinds of inducements for corruption, and all kinds of institutional failure. That ultimately this system that we've created, and about which there is essentially a bipartisan trans-ideological consensus, is one that is not working.
Right. You bring up some, in the past decade, or now the past 12 years, some of the failures at the beginning were so catastrophic at the time, but now just feel like historical footnotes, with WorldCom and Enron being the most obvious ones. Like, we think WorldCom was one of the biggest bankruptcies in cases of corporate failure that we saw. But now, compared to Lehman Brothers, it just feels like something that just kind of came and went.
Yeah, and Enron was the largest corporate bankruptcy in history, and it's been eclipsed by the carnage of the financial crisis. But it's sort of amazing to look back at that, and particularly to go back through the Enron years, because that was such a big deal when it happened, and it happened in the strange moment where The aftermath of it was far enough removed from, I mean, it was in the midst of the aftermath of 9/11, but it was the first big news story to happen essentially after 9/11 and before the Iraq War. And it was a period of genuine political peril for President George W. Bush, because obviously he had strong connections to the corporation and Ken Lay, who ran it. But it was a really remarkable moment because a lot of the internal dynamics that brought it down we would see later replicated in Wall Street in the financial crisis.
Right. It's important to understand when you look back at the past decade, there's the depth of failure, but there's also the breadth of failure, right? So like virtually every single institution, from the military to the corporate world to the financial corporate world to political structures across each branch, the Supreme Court, Congress, and now the president, all have crises. And, the numbers start to drop off in terms of trust in political institutions from Watergate. But from what I understand, they're at record lows now. They're even worse than some of the more generic, some of the more big crises of the past 30 years, or 50 years, including Watergate. Is that correct?
Yeah, what's fascinating actually is that the polling on this issue begins in 1973, more or less, precipitated by Watergate and the sensation people had in the wake of Watergate that the country was experiencing crisis of authority, that you no longer knew what you could trust, and it wasn't just Watergate. It was. Let me read a quote from here. This is the kind of thing you can't do on live television. Flip through your book to find something. It wasn't just Watergate. I mean, it was the end of the Iraq War as well.
The Vietnam War.
I'm sorry, the Vietnam War. Important.
It does blur together.
Important distinction. Here's the James Reston quote, and this is sort of a perfect example of the feeling of the time. This is James Reston writing in the New York Times, April 8th, 1970. Behind all the questions of politics, ideologies, and personalities lies the larger issue of public confidence and trust in the institutions of the nation. That trust does not exist now. The authority of the government, of the church, of the university, and even of the family is under challenge all over the republic, and men of all ages, stations, and persuasions agree that this crisis of confidence is one of the most important and dangerous problems of the age. He's writing that 3 years before Watergate. After Watergate, that sensation only intensifies, and this polling begins. And the remarkable thing about the polling is that, in retrospect, the years after Watergate are actually a high point for public trust in institutions. And our current conundrum is the actual low point. And that just shows just how devastating the failed decade has been to this basic trust in authority.
So, and to contrast it from a long decline in his institutions, you track it to something called, that you describe as the meritocracy, which has risen over the past 20 or 30 years. Can you talk us through a little bit about what that is and how it's impacted the institutions they've taken over?
So So first, let me start with the word meritocracy, which has a fascinating history. We use that word in American life as both. It's the name we give to our social ideal, which is a system in which people can rise from any station in life, in which we do not bar entry into the elite based on race, gender, ethnicity, religious creed, geography, right? We want Dominican kids from the South Bronx to be able to become Wall Street bankers. We want a gay woman from a farm in Kansas to be able to go to Harvard Law School, right? Then we're going to open up the doors to the elite to everyone, and then everyone competes, and we have a set of institutions that are set up to essentially sort out the smartest, most industrious, and talented, and elevate them to these positions in which they have power, status, money, remuneration, etc. That's what the meritocracy is, and it's a repudiation of the kind of elite formation that came before it, which was what we called the establishment, and it was white men, WASP white men from the Northeast, who were funneled through a set of very specific institutions, and their elite status was conferred by their pedigree, right? It was conferred by their familial inheritance from being from a very specific, narrow cultural milieu. Ironically, the term meritocracy was coined by a leftist parliamentarian and social critic and sociologist in Britain named Michael Young, who wrote a book in 1955 called The Rise of the Meritocracy, which was meant to be a satirical vision of a dystopic future in which intelligence testing, both in education and inside businesses and organizations, had become so razor sharp that it created this perverse caste system in which the smartest were elevated to the positions of power and everyone else was left at the bottom. And he was writing about what a monstrous system this would be, how it would become this rigid, impenetrable caste system that would ultimately collapse in on itself. And ironically, meritocracy was then adopted here in the U.S. and then also in Britain as a compliment, right? As the ideal. He was sketching out a dystopia. It would be like, saying like, if we decided like we're going to call our social model the Animal Farm or something,
right.
Or like
social Darwinism,
right? Like we're really, yeah, exactly. Like exactly. If you said that like we're trying to create a brave new world, right? You sort of miss the point of the satire. And in fact, Young writes an op-ed in 2001 when he's nearing death, saying he just is flabbergasted and disappointed by the fact that meritocracy has been adopted as a model. So meritocracy is, it's a new way of thinking about an old American idea, the American dream, which de Tocqueville writes about and various authors throughout American history, which is a republic founded without the inheritance of feudalism, though obviously with slavery, but for white people, for non-slaves, right? The lack of a feudal prehistory meant that the possibilities of social mobility, and also the fact that there was cheap land available, meant the possibilities of social mobility that were unrivaled in Europe. And so you have a situation in which the meritocracy is an updating of an old idea of the American dream, starting out at a low station in life, working your way up to the top based solely on your talent and merits. And, Barack Obama is the crowning achievement of that system, and it embodies a lot of what I think is amazingly noble and liberatory about it as a social model, particularly compared to the one that preceded it, which is that only under the system of meritocracy could a man with that name, that background, that skin color, be elected president of the United States, have gone through these elite institutions like Harvard Law and ended up where he's ended up.
Right. And to interject, you mentioned the 19th century and kind of previous visions of American freedom. One thing, though, and you allude to it in the book, is or you actually bring it up quite specifically in the book, is that there's always been a vision of freedom about essentially self-ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Yeoman farmers, people who have their own plot of land, who take care of themselves and their families, in this kind of more communitarian vision. And what the meritocracy is also, it's about a theory of how to pick elites, right? It precludes the idea that there's going to be elites that need to run things.
That's right. It is in deep tension with those kind of small d democratic impulses, right? Because the idea is that, and that's partly produced by the fact that, a post-industrial society, a society that's gone through an industrial revolution, a society that went through the progressive era and then the New Deal, and a global economy is producing institutions of greater and greater complexity and larger reach. And there's a sense in which, we need people to run them. And so how are we going to choose those people? I mean, that's not necessarily the explicit conversation we're having, but that was kind of the explicit conversation that, say, James Conant Bryant, who was the president of Harvard University, who oversaw the rise of the SAT testing regime, which is really wonderfully documented in Nick Lemon's book. That was what he was thinking about quite explicitly. So there's a certain degree to which meritocracy is a form of elite selection quite explicitly, even if that's not the way we talk about it, as much as it is embodiment of our ideals about social mobility.
So one thing I bring up in my review, one thing I really liked about the book is that it threads this really difficult needle of how to critique the meritocracy right now in this moment, because there are three standard critiques, and I think I have problems with all of them, and your book also clearly is trying to navigate between them. And to summarize quickly, the first kind of meritocracy critique is a conservative one. I mean, David Brooks and other people bring it up. It's the idea that essentially the meritocracy is too open, that the wrong kind of people are getting into it, and they don't have quite the sense of obligation that they should have.
Right.
There's a second critique that's a little bit more left wing, but it's broad. Is that the problem with meritocratic elites is just elites, period.
Right.
And that the only real way to transcend this is to kind of embrace really radical forms of democracy. You see this with the manifestos surrounding WikiLeaks, which Aaron Beatty, who's been on the show before, has talked about at length online. You see it obviously with the Occupy movement and the whole horizontalism of the General Assembly. And then the third critique is kind of, how can the meritocracy have failed? Because we've never really tried it.
Right.
And, the idea that the real problem is just that, we don't have good enough testing. We don't have the right kind of, preschools or the right kind of actual genuine equality of opportunity for people to really make sure the meritocracy works.
Right.
And I read your book as obviously dealing with all three of those critiques. And I'm kind of curious what you think of those and how your own theory develops around them.
So I think the nostalgia argument is wrong and misplaced, but not completely without some kernel of truth, which is that the old elite, and this is actually something that's drawn out in book form by John Judas in his book Paradox of American Democracy, which is that the old establishment had its own pathologies and neuroses and horrible attributes, but because it was not born of a system of constant and ceaseless competition, there was a larger cultural ethos carved out for public-mindedness and vouchsafing the public interest than I think our current meritocratic elite allows for. And I think the reason the current one doesn't is that the two things, the being acculturated to constant competition makes you constantly feel competitive, envious, looking up the next rung of the ladder rather down at those who are below you. And two, the absolute size of the payouts on top for cashing out produce incentives, constant incentives for corruption. I mean, if someone said to you, Mike Konczal, we want you to come work at our think tank that does climate denial science, and we will pay you $100,000 a year. You say no. And they say, we'll pay you $1 million a year. You say no. And say, we'll pay you $20 million a year. Now, I think you're a man of tremendous integrity, and you would still say no. But most people do have a price, right? Right. I mean, at a certain point, you're going to say, okay, well, you're going to justify yourself. I'll go work for them. I'll take the $20 million. I'll actually give it to folks that are actually doing good climate work, etc.
It doesn't have to be pure corruption. It could just be here's $50,000 to just not talk about it so much,
exactly,
or to include us in the conversation. I mean, there's such a soft form of that corruption,
and the size,
all kinds of elite discussion,
and that's a place where the absolute size of the payouts matter. This is a really important point. I'm not even sure if I quite hammer this or articulate this in the book as well as I could have, but one of the perverse consequences of rising inequality and the extremeness at the tail end of the distribution is that those absolute sizes really do matter in terms of how they incentivize people to act. So there is something to the nostalgia argument, but I don't think it's a particularly good one, because I think all the things that were inbred and corrupt about that old establishment are not something that we want to recreate, particularly as progressives. I think there is something profound, and there's something to the horizontalism argument, the rejection of elites per se. And I'm largely sympathetic to them insofar as I think we need to have a discourse that has a strong variant that is forcing us to return to the radicalness of our small d democratic commitments. That the foundation of democracy is a genuinely radical proposition that we are all equal in determining how we are all going to get along and self-govern. And it's very easy, because of the system of representation we have, because of the complexity we have, because of the alienation we feel from people we elect, and because the attenuation of that representation over time, to lose sight of that being the core fact of democracy, which is that it means that we are all deciding what we are all going to do, which means the people that you take the subway with in the morning, the people online at the Target who are driving you crazy because they can't scan properly their goods, the people at work who you love or can't stand or gossip about, all of those people, all of us are deciding together. And that was the radical spirit under which the General Assembly was conducted, and I think, inspirationally so. Ultimately, however, there are problems in the scalability of that. And so I think that there are going to be elites in some senses. We do have a representative democracy. So there's going to be United States senators, there's going to be members of Congress, President of the United States. And I think that I would love to see more horizontalism in our institutions as broadly. I'd love to see corporate structures that have less hierarchy and concentration of power. And we're seeing some of that, right? I mean, some of the, Wikipedia and Kickstarter and some of the things on the internet are really putting that genuine horizontalism into practice in an amazing way, and I'm all for that. But I also think that there's going to be some set of elites, and we would stand to do a lot better if they were closer to everyone and if they were produced in institutions that made them more competent, better decision makers, and less corrupt. And then the final critique about we've never actually tried equality of opportunity, that actually gets at the core of what I think is, to the extent it is novel about my own critique, is that, in the same way people will talk about, there's the cliche about, an unreconstructed Marxist saying, well, we've never really actually tried true Marxism, right? And the most powerful critique, I think, of Marxism is the fact that, there's something actually embedded in it theoretically that leads it to be corrupted in reality. There's actually a theoretical problem there with its assumptions. Every time you try to instantiate it, it gives rise to a relatively small, morally bankrupt, corrupt, oligarchic elite that runs things, right? And that's the critique that I'm offering of meritocracy. It's true we have never lived up to our promises of equal opportunity. But the reason we haven't is because there's something actually embedded in the meritocratic model, which accepts inequality of outcomes so vast that makes delivering on that promise of equality of opportunity actually impossible.
Let's theory out for a little while here because it's the internet and this isn't a normal media show. Walk us through the iron law of oligarchy,
sure,
which you walk your audience or your readers through in the book, and what it means to have the same kind of dynamics show up in the meritocracy. Because I do think that's a really powerful and original point that we see in practice, but also very much works in theory as well.
Yeah, so the iron law of oligarchy it comes from a remarkable book called Political Parties, written by a German sociologist who is a star student of Max Weber. His name is Robert Michels, and he's a fascinating guy. And I should say here, again, because we're on the internet and people will, that Henry Farrell was the one who pointed me to Michels during a walk we took on a very hot DC day when batting around the ideas of the book. Michels is a fascinating character. He's a German leftist. He is operating in a Germany that is putatively democratic, but controlled by a lot of powerful interests, or sort of oscillating between real democracy and putative democracy. And he's from the left, and he's part of a group of anarcho-syndicalists, Social Democratic Party. First, he starts at the Social Democratic Party. He gets frustrated with them for being overly bureaucratic. Then he moves to a more explicitly anarcho-syndicalist, left-wing radical party. But he's also frustrated with them. And the question that occupies him and occupies the book is this. He says, I look at the right-wing parties, and their organizations are hierarchical and egalitarian with a small group on top wielding all the power in the party. He says that makes sense because that's what they believe in. That's actually the vision that they're trying to push forward in society. But then I look at the left-wing parties, and they're the same way, even though they're committed to democracy and equality. Why is it? Why is it the fact that the left-wing parties seem to be ruled by this relatively small clique? And the answer he comes up with, which he lays out in the book, is what he calls the iron law of oligarchy. The shortest summary of which is, he who says organization says oligarchy. And the basic idea is, okay, you start a political party or you start a labor union, and it's based on democratic participation, but someone has to take notes at the meeting. Someone has to run the printing press for the leaflets that tell everybody when the meetings are going to meet, and someone's got to book the room for the meetings. And some small group of people are going to do these logistical tasks, and once those people gain power over the logistical tasks that is necessitated by just the basic human fact of the division of labor and organization, they become imbued with disproportionate amounts of power and can then use that power to subvert the egalitarian ethos of the organization, and you end up with this small coterie of people running the organization. And if you've ever reported on a labor union, for instance, this is hauntingly familiar, right? I mean, and I think if you spent time at Occupy Wall Street, it's hauntingly familiar. I mean, it is, I think, a profound and largely accurate analysis. Michels, interestingly, would basically later give up on the idea of democracy altogether and think that the only way to get it, anything approximating egalitarianism or representation of the vote, was in the figurehead of a charismatic leader, and he became a fascist and a kind of pet scribe of Benito Mussolini, which is depressing. At the time,
Weber was very big into charismatic leadership. So
yeah, well,
I was going to wonder if you were going to bring up that he ended up in a very bad place.
He ended up in a bad place, and actually, the iron law of oligarchy is something that's much more martial to the extent that it's remembered. You don't see it that much talked about, even though I think it's pretty important. It's much more martial by the right, as a kind of proto-public choice theory, right, about rent seeking,
right,
and about the kind of corruption of enterprises that start with noble egalitarian intentions. The Michels of the time actually just has this beautiful passage that I quote all the time, because the one who wrote Political Parties was still a leftist, and basically he gets to the end of the book and he says, well, what do we make of all this? Like, when we're actually engaged in an egalitarian project, how should we walk away from the analysis I've laid out? He basically says, I think of a fable of an old farmer who's dying on a small plot of land. He tells his two sons that there's treasure buried on their land, and then he dies. And the two sons go digging everywhere to find the treasure. And they never find the treasure, but the actual digging of the land cultivates it and makes it richer and secures for them a relative well-being. And Michel says, the treasure in the fable symbolizes democracy, which is to say we may never actually find it. But in seeking and struggling for it, we secure for ourselves a relative well-being, a relative democracy, which I think is just an absolutely stirring, poetic vision of what being on the left always is, essentially.
Right.
So that's
disappointments put to the larger end of actually trying to just well, actually, and then it does say something, right? It's like the process is part of the goal, right? The actual act of showing up every day and trying to build democracy, going to general assemblies or knocking on doors and trying to harness people power is, in and of itself is part of the project, right? It's not just an unfortunate byproduct in order to get to a goal, but it is part of the goal.
It is part of the goal.
I think that's a really good story.
And also, it also says that, I said this when I was talking politics and prose, the other lesson there is that there's no final victory, right? I mean, there's no point. I mean, I think sometimes people on the left fantasize of like, we're going to, finally vanquish conservatives. Like, we're not going to. Like, there's no moment where we plant the flag and declare it over. There's no, in fact, what people on the left struggle for and what Michel's shows us is true is that the thing that we want, which is democracy, which is the upending of hierarchies, is not itself stable as an equilibrium. It can only be preserved through a dynamic process of struggle. But that's a tangent. The way that the
one last thing, I want to sit down for 1 second. Eric Olin Wright is this. I think he's a sociologist at University of Wisconsin-Madison. He wrote a book called The Socialist Compass, which he said, at this point, he wrote it a few years ago, built out off lectures from the past 20 years, says the roadmaps are gone. Like, to the extent that there were ever left roadmaps, and roadmaps have two things. They have a destination, and then they have different paths. And some paths are very quick, and some paths are very, very quick, but very difficult. And then some paths require backing up and going around. He says both those elements are no longer in play. What we need to think about having is a compass, which is just a way of saying, are we getting closer or further away from a destination? And it's just directional, right? You're never at north. You're never at east. But you're always getting closer or further away from that point. And I think that's I think that's actually a very powerful image for people who are engaged in egalitarian left politics to harness and use.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we were saying linking up the meritocracy
with
the failure. So how does this kind of thing lead to the failures of the past 10 years?
Right. So the analogy I then use to draw out the iron law of meritocracy is basically says, who says meritocracy says oligarchy, meaning that the same dynamics that he recognized in kind of egalitarian democratic organizations in political parties, I am saying of meritocracies, which is if you concede this deeply inegalitarian premise, which is some small group of people are going to have disproportionate power, inevitably they will use that disproportionate power to subvert whatever mechanisms of accountability, turnover, mobility that you want to put in place. I mean, there's simple ways, wealthy donors giving a wing of a science center, and then their kid gets into that school, right? There's a bunch of obvious ways we watch this happen all the time. Less morally corrosive ways, I tell the very small parable of my own high school, which is a public magnet school, which has seen a test prep industry grow up around it that wasn't there 15 years ago. And, there's a lot of debate. I've seen people actually critique this online about, how effective test prep is. The teachers I talk to think it has resulted in the decline of African American and Hispanic students. But that said, it's clearly a place in which these mechanisms of mobility, right, which is the single test that everybody takes to get in, are being subverted by the inequality of outcomes. Some people can afford to pay a tutor $90 an hour or $1,000 a week, and some can't. And so
it's also an arms race, right, at that point, because it only needs to be a little bit effective.
Yep.
To be a very incredible filter. And once you start having those incremental steps, everyone needs to do them, or you're going to leave behind a huge amount of population very quickly.
That's right, and that's actually a funny thing about the way that these kind of like meritocratic competitive arms races work. I mean, I think I say this in the book, although maybe I said this and then it got cut. But I mean, it's funny to think about. When you think about the steroids era in baseball, which I write about quite a bit in the book. It was almost certainly the case, right, that you had during the steroids era, as we've learned that pitchers were also taking steroids, that you had a batter at the plate on steroids facing a pitcher on the mound on steroids, having what would essentially be the exact same interaction they would both have if they both weren't on steroids, right? Like they're actually not getting at that point a net benefit, which is the same thing that you could imagine a situation in which every single student who took the Hunter test is engaging in test prep. Right? And let's just say, for the sake of the thought experiment, it's all essentially as effective. Then everybody's paying a lot of money to have the exact same competition with each other they would be having in the absence of the test prep.
Right. And the moment that one of those steps becomes even slightly dubious or unethical, or things that we would in aggregate like to prevent, I think the fractal inequality thing is really important with this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But once the rewards are so high, and conversely, the penalty for being left behind in the meritocracy is so severe that even the most unethical things, like steroids, as you brought up in baseball, become a no-brainer. Right? They become something that you're just compelled to take part of.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that when you think about, Major League Baseball is a pretty perfect meritocracy. You don't, it really is the case. No one cares who your dad is, or what kind of social capital you have. If you can hit, you can hit. If you're a 19-year-old Dominican kid who no one's ever heard of, who doesn't speak English, if you can play, you're going to play. And so even in very pure meritocracies, if you have big rewards it's harder than it looks to design a system with big rewards for performance and harsh penalties for failure that isn't also a system with big rewards for cheating. And that's what we saw in Major League Baseball, and it's what we've seen in Wall Street, and it's what we saw in Enron as well.
Yeah, and what's probably moving into the education sector and a lot of other sectors.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
One tension in the book that I really like is how the meritocracy views itself in relation to the greater populace, right? So on one hand, there's a real self-regard, right? There's their ability that they have actually been chosen for merit based on their intelligence.
Right.
They can rank their intelligence quite often through cash or through other very elite positions that are often monetizable. So, there's an anxiety about the person who's one step up from you.
Yep.
On the other hand, there's a subchapter in the book called Open Secrets, which is the fact that a lot of these things are so manipulable, and things that you can actually juke or cheat to increase your score in the short term, means that there's a kind of, maybe not a contempt, but a sense that the thing's all kind of rigged, and that there are these open secrets where people know that they're cheating and that they know that they're acting recklessly, but that they just kind of have to go with it. Can you develop those two different kinds of ways the meritocracy view their actions together?
Yeah, the Open Secrets chapter, to take the latter first, which is specifically about Wall Street during the housing bubble and Enron and Major League Baseball, is about the kind of extreme, the kind of logical moral endpoint of a meritocracy in the midst of moral freefall, which is because of the intensely competitive nature of those environments, that when you introduce an entrepreneur who discards previous norms about what it is and not done, that behavior spreads like wildfire through the institution. And then you end up in this place where everyone kind of knows it's happening, and the way that they tell themselves it's okay is essentially through this process of joking about it, of making it an open secret. You know, Jose Canseco says in his memoir about players would joke about going to get their B12 shot, right? And everyone knew what that was. And you have Fabrice Touré, who's the trader at Goldman Sachs, who was named in the SEC complaint about selling investors these derivatives that are designed like IEDs to blow up, right? And you have him writing to his girlfriend saying, like, I just sold them to widows and orphans, like, haha, you know, understanding exactly what he's doing and making light of it. So that's in an institutional setting, the worst kind of moral rot that can take hold in meritocracy. At the social level, I don't think we're quite there yet, because I do think people still cling to the delusion of that the game is not rigged and that they're not rigging it. And I think one of the really pernicious aspects of the meritocracy is that it requires everyone who ascends through it to construct for themselves a narrative about their own achievement, in which that achievement was a process of overcoming, of coming from the outside into the inside, of climbing a hill with no aid. And I am implicated in this myself. I mean, I should be pretty clear here, right? I have a cable news show, and I have a very, very, very lucky and fortunate to have a not trivial platform. And I am the product of these meritocratic institutions, and I want to tell myself this story of a scrappy, you know, hardworking kid from the outer boroughs, working class Bronx. My dad was a community organizer, and I was an educator who like overcame, you know, somehow ended up with a TV show. The fact of the matter is I had two parents who had 4-year college degrees, who cared a tremendous amount about education, who were amazingly nurturing and loving, and produced a environment where, you know, I could flourish. And even if that's just me. I mean, we even see it all the way up to Mitt Romney, who gets before a Republican presidential primary audience and says, you know, I could have inherited the car company, but I walked away from that. I struck out on my own, right? Went to Harvard Law and Harvard Business School, and started Bain Capital and made every cent myself. Or Ann Romney talking about the time they were living in dingy student housing, and she had to staple together carpet samples on the floor and sell Mitt's inherited car stock to make ends meet, which is just a manifestly preposterous story of meritocratic, you know, achievement, and yet it is genuinely felt. And it's the raw genuineness of it that I think makes it so insidious.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about where we can go from here, but to take a quick detour, you know, you've obviously read quite a bit about the meritocracy, where it came from, and how it strengthened and became quite a hegemonic way of looking at both success and desert and a bunch of other things about how our elites run the country. In a very short amount of time. You know, we're talking essentially the mid-'60s.
Right.
Your book, when I read your book, I take away the idea that it comes through, in general, expanding democracy, right? It's expanding access. That, you know, a generation ago, we would not necessarily think GLBTQ people, women, minorities should have the same set of opportunities as everyone else. But now that's not necessarily the rule of the law everywhere, but it's certainly much more accepted, and that's part of the democratic story. There's also a kind of conservative message, or I don't know if conservative is the right framework for it, but this kind of Horatio Alger, like, I made myself out of nothing. And even, you know, everyone has this story, right? You know, even for people who have a lot, they want to really emphasize their struggle, and that struggle has produced what they have, and that what they have is a result of struggling with the meritocracy. And then the third thing, and I want to do this in the review, but I couldn't quite find a good way to bring it in, is how much are you worried that you're grabbing the wrong end of the stick here, and that this is really a story about market logic? Mm-hmm. And one of the key things about market logic is that resources go to where they're the best deployed. Mm-hmm. And normally it's prices that do that, but I can't really price myself into elite positions, but I can pay a shadow price in terms of test scores and prepping myself and fashioning myself in such a way that's pliable to be used by elite resources. And I'm curious how much the idea of the market always rewarding desert and always putting people and items to their best economic uses is really what's driving the meritocracy obsession as opposed to more democratic kind of impulses.
That's a really good question. I guess I think that the story of meritocracy and the story about market rewards for merit reinforce each other in all kinds of pernicious ways. I also think the story about the kind of marketization of American life is true, but a story that other people have told. And I don't think the whole truth, right? So I do think that like this, the degree to which we have this embedded set of assumptions about what the social model is of how we select people, quote, at the top, is very important in reinforcing this. And you see it in this very, Ayn Randian kind of job creator rhetoric from Mitt Romney. The funny thing is, there's actually a great essay that was written in Reason refuting the idea of market meritocracy. Mm-hmm. And basically saying, look, markets don't reward the best and the brightest, the most visionary. They just reward ideas that happen to work. and happening to work can confer a great social value, right? I mean, Facebook, for instance, which, is a complicated story, but, produces something really of value that people want and like to use. That doesn't mean that Mark Zuckerberg is a genius. And that's a very, very hard thing to untether.
Right.
But an actual honest, even conservative free market look at economics, the genius of the market isn't that it rewards the best people. It's that it produces the most social utility almost through a kind of accidental process, not unlike evolution. Right?
Right.
And so the back half of that, is the fact that the story of meritocracy is actually is needed to then do that justificatory work. You see what I mean?
Right.
Because the logic of capitalism actually is that all this stuff is kind of accidents, right? I mean, and so and happy accidents and accidents we should encourage, and in fact that's what's great about the market and the price system, but not like just rewards for genius. The idea that it's just reward for genius is actually not really that grounded in what the actual theory of the free market is. That's grounded in a whole bunch of myths that we have about American society.
Right.
Go
ahead.
And with that, I'm really sorry, Mike, but I have to end this conversation. Maybe we can do another one because there's a lot more to talk about, and your review was so thorough. But I have to unfortunately take my leave to go do a bunch of other move some book units, as it were.
No problem. Well, thank you so much, and it really is a great book, and I thank you very much for writing and joining us this afternoon.
I really appreciate it, man.
Take care.